Hello and welcome back to our Total War 25th Anniversary Retrospective series. This time we're talking about the Bronze Age, so we're going to be looking at all things Troy and Pharaoh. I'm Will White, Senior Content Producer here at Creative Assembly. You might recognise my voice, but this is my face. This time my face is joined by these lovely faces. So let's do some introductions. Maya, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Hey Will.
Hiya.
My name is Maya Georgieva. I am currently the franchise design director for Total War. But back on Troy and Pharaoh, I was the game director on Troy and a creative director for our studio in Sofia, supporting the project of Pharaoh during its development.
Cool, awesome. And Victor.
Hey.
Hello.
So right now I'm creative director on Total War Warhammer DLCs, but back for Troy specifically, I was in charge for the Amazon's DLCs and bits and pieces of the overall product of Troy. And in Pharaoh, I was in a different project, but I was at the same time sitting in the same building like with the rest of the guys, and I was constantly peeking into their monitors. So like I was part of the project one way or another.
You were there in spirit. Jack.
I'm Jack Mellum. I'm lead music designer on Troy and Pharaoh. I think I was senior music designer. I can't remember exactly when it swapped, but yeah, I was a senior music designer on Troy and Pharaoh.
Awesome. Cool. Let's dive into it then.
Let's do.
Starting with, let's talk about just the vision of the game. Like, where did it come from? What was the
Just
inspiration?
the vision.
Yeah, just the vision.
Such an innocent question. First thing I remember about Troy specifically was we as a team were still, kind of learning the ropes of Total War, and we were working on Empire Divided, the DLC for Rome, and we were looking at potential ideas for content, games, different, just design notes. And amongst multiple options, there was this name, just one name, nothing, no design documentation, no, expanded kind of guidance, just Trojan War. And we were like, whoa, this sort of resonates. Imagine if we would one day be able to do a full game about it. Maybe this could be something that we could do. But and it came to be basically later, after a couple of DLCs, the team was ready and eager to try, creating a full standalone game. And back in the day, this was something that was like an unclaimed territory, like something that we could try and make our own and produce our first project. And I think that from current perspective, we were probably a little bit naive, a little bit too eager. Maybe we both, we've bitten more than we could chew, because once we actually took up creating this project, creating this game, it was full with, challenges and issues that we need to solve. And maybe it wasn't the best for our first project, but we were kind of ambitious, we were kind of eager. So
Say it, ambitious.
That's hard.
We were joking back in the day that our motto should be ambitious, not that smart.
That's us.
I mean,
That's
could you
funny.
say?
I didn't hear that one from the UK. It was really interesting from the UK studio side of it, because obviously we had central team supporting you guys, music being one of them. So hearing one this is the first solo big project the team's going to work on. It was really interesting hearing what that project was going to be, and it's like, oh cool, that's quite a big narrative driven event that's going to be a really interesting one to work on.
Yeah, I think that there's something in the name, right? There's something like a big promise in it. You don't know why, but it captures your attention, and it did ours, so we jumped on it.
Yeah, I mean, it's steeped in history, isn't it? There's so much you can actually unpack there. So how did you go about with the historical accuracy? Because I mean, we've got the Iliads, we've got...
It's hard to speak about accuracy, because the matter is largely legendary. So there are different levels to unpack here. On one end, what everybody knows about Troy is a legend, it's a myth. And so this is also what everybody relates to. What is the gravity of the story is the gravity towards this myth that has survived so many centuries. on the other end, it was fascinating to realize, to kind of uncover that this was not just a narrative story. This was not just like a novel created for entertainment. There were bits and pieces behind these legends that were actual history potentially. And once we started kind of researching the era, researching the archaeology, researching the historical information about it, we realized there is more there than we would actually expect.
That level of authenticity is great, but how did you guys bring any more to it, like music? Jack, did you?
Yeah, music's really difficult when you get back that far in history, because you have very scant records of what music was like, and even if you get images of music being played, you don't know anything like the tuning, you don't know what it sounded like. You can have, there are some very old scores and you're still like, okay, well, don't really know what that note was. You can look at it and go, okay, well, this is probably how it's evolved, looking at how music in different areas of the world have evolved during that time. But obviously there's a lot of upheaval in different places, so it could have changed wildly. So you kind of have to do your best in a lot of these things and try and trace back some of the instrumentation and instrument choices. So one of them was the yale tambur that we used. That was only really something from 1910s, and it's like, okay, that's super modern, but it's also based on this, the tambur, which is more like 1500s, and it's like, okay, we're getting a little bit further back. And then you look at it, it's like, okay, it probably was used in the Byzantine era as well in this similar sort of part of the world. And we get back that far and we're still like 2,000 years out from where we need to be. And it's like, this is really difficult. So yeah, a lot of it, we like do the best we can and try and create the essence of that feeling. And one of the reasons I think so, the new music direction from the music director at that time was to have the really synthetic score, was to have that sort of mystical element part of it that's very different from like the Rome 2 soundtrack, which has got a lot more of sort of an orchestral, like cinematic basis to try and get that more mystical vibe, I guess, and sort of
and it definitely did.
Yeah, it definitely did. Yeah,
I remember the first time, in the initial drafts, basically for the soundtrack, were presented to me and to the team, basically, because we immediately spread like quite wildfire in the office. Everybody was curious and wanted to hear. And initially it was kind of divisive because some people were like, wow, this is awesome. And some were like, but why is this like that?
Yeah, the first versions were really synth heavy as well. Like all the instrumentation came later. A lot of those early ones, it was just pure synth.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, okay, this is
very modern.
Yeah.
But why were the Greeks doing a rave party?
Yeah, for sure. It was quite a bold choice, to be sure. I remember the first time because when I first started working.
But it had this quality of sounding like expressing the sense of eternity of.
We were trying to follow the art direction in that sense of this sort of otherworldly element to some of it, that sort of mythological vibe, and we tried to sort of copy that in the music. I remember the first time I heard it because I'd been on previous projects and then joined it and was like, this is a lot of synths. It was quite an interesting one to join, and then blending that together as the project came along.
In some sense, it came out of necessity. It came out of finding solutions to irrational problems. We had, for example, a problem of what art style do we use for our interface, for our representation in the game. We're looking at Minoan frescoes initially, which would be sort of contemporary to the era, but they were not necessarily fitting well and sitting well with the story, with the factions, with the whole game, basically with the theme. They were like, yes, they are from the time, but they are not representative of what we are from the conflict. And ultimately, we decided also to kind of bring it also closer to what players and audiences would recognize and know and potentially love, which was more the classical Greek representation. And that's where we tried and kind of embraced this style of black figure pottery that represents, the characters in their classical way, with also the ornaments and so on and so forth. And we decided, okay, but how does this style that comes like multiple centuries later mesh with the reality of the Bronze Age we're representing? And we thought about, like how to make them, gel together, and decided that ultimately what we want to represent here is, on the top level, you see those classical references. And then you see the layer of the shroud in the game, which was like a parchment with notes from the actual Iliad in ancient Greek. Not that anyone will recognize, but we actually checked them out and they are authentic. And this shroud is burned to reveal the living and breathing reality of the Bronze Age. And ultimately, this is how we go step by step from legend to reality, to the living myth underneath. And honestly, this didn't come like in a spark of inspiration over one night or whatever. It was painfully developed over months of a lot of, arguments and contradictions and whatnot.
You were talking earlier about the skybox, which when I first saw it, I was like, wow, this is such a cool
amazing,
feature of it. How that design came upon.
Initially, our art direction was leaning more towards realism, basically, and there were clear blue skies and everything was beautiful. But suddenly we were kind of given feedback and asked, okay, if you have a look at this game, if you pass a glance at a screenshot of this game, can you recognize this is Troy and not any other Total War game in the ancient times? And you were like, is that necessary? Yes. Figured it out. And we were like, okay, if you must do. So we were like almost panicking, like, what can we do? So I was playing with in Photoshop with mockups. Our art director was, picking up stuff, and they did an amazing job in that, creating this skybox that is so distinctive.
Yeah, it's very cool. I remember seeing that and being like, this, like, I can see Troy now. Yeah, it's cool.
And the only thing that I regretted was that I wanted to have, like, the figures from Greek mythology that represent the different places in the world. So basically, if you look to the northeast, you should see Caucasus, the mountain with Prometheus and the eagle. Nice. And if you look to the west, you would see the pillars of Hercules and something like that. So basically, to kind of be able, and when you look to the south, you would see, for example, the cow Io, I think it's called in English.
It is.
From Greek mythology, who went into Egypt was probably we could have did it in an Egypt sort of style. So this didn't get into the initial game, but I was nagging a little bit on that because of technical limitations, mind you. Yeah. And also because of artistic limitations, because they think, okay, we are not going to draw a cartoon. But ultimately, in the Mythos pack later, we actually added
that in.
Some of this.
Yeah, you had all the gods in the sky as well for the Mythos pack in the battle maps, wasn't it? And that was awesome.
Also, even before that, before we crystallized our art style and everything, there were of course supporters going about let's just do it fantasy, let's go full mythological from the start. There'll be the Cerberus, there'll be all the different mythological creatures from the cycles. Of course, we have like fans of that in the office, and they're like, yeah, it will be all fantasy and all magic, and then we'll go Age of Mythology, Total War, and our reality was like, first of all, that's super expensive animations and requests, so no. And second of all, we're also doing Total War Warhammer, I believe 2 at the time, so that's kind of already feeling that.
It felt slightly redundant. And this was very interesting because different, kind of camps in the office
Historical facts.
leaning more towards, super authenticity towards the Iliad, 100%. Authenticity towards history, authenticity, and basically not authenticity, but kind of a fantasy angle that we just use mythology and have like armies of minotaurs and so
Zeus
on.
wandering around.
So that was the sort of three directions and three visions, and ultimately we had to make a choice, and the choice was hard.
It was.
The choice was not so much a compromise, but ultimately, to me, the truth behind the myth also allowed us to establish a base, and from there we could have the options to explore either of the other directions if we have, the opportunity, right? So, and we did. So that was good.
So is that how you then decided when it came to Pharaoh, for example, to just stick to the historical side because you knew already that there was too much debate internally between the mythos, between the historical? So how did that come about? What was the learnings you took essentially?
Very much that was part of the sensibility, the thinking about it, because it was one thing, initially we thought that, okay, this confusion is within us, within the office, within the team. But then we realized this actually is representative for the audience as well. There were people leaning in each of those directions anyway. So we realized that doing any product, any game in the context of an audience that doesn't have an established single vision about the game basically means that whatever you choose, part of the audience
It's halfway wrong.
will consider it wrong. So leveraging a topic and a vision that is unequivocal, it is the same for everybody, is highly beneficial. And if you have like a huge Hollywood movie that establishes particular vision, this is very lucky. If you have like a particular, again, pop culture representation, you could latch to that. We didn't have that for Troy entirely, despite, movies existing. But for Pharaoh, going full historical was
Liberating.
Was okay.
In a sense.
It was
for
possible.
designers, for developers.
Yeah, it was absolutely possible. There were a lot of materials that we could actually lean on, and that was much straightforward to develop.
It saddens me a bit. I personally really bought into this idea. I still think it's one of the most original things I have experienced in game development. Honestly, not to pat my own shoulder, but it wasn't my idea. So to me, it was super fresh, this thing of trying to show two realities at the same time, the truth and the myth, and how like maybe it's not real, but the people in that age and point of time thought it was real. So what if we were like looking at the side and we as developers kind of add to the reality of the triviality of the real world that was there. Maybe like there are gods in the background that people do not see, in like characters in the game do not see, but the players see, and that makes them like, because just because they're not real, they were real for those people. Now we think they're not real, but for those people they were real. So
they're part of their worldview.
So me and Maya often talk about it, like maybe we didn't do good enough job on that, because we believed in it. Like maybe it was a matter of resources, maybe we were like new, didn't know how to do it better, but I still think that was the right choice. Just not many people were able to truly like experience it the way we wish to, kind of, which is on us. But
it's if game development was a roguelite, we would have run a run and probably do it better. But we do it as well as we could at the time. In the battle side of things, we didn't have traditional cavalry, which is one of the most beloved sort of units.
Why can't I charge cycle?
And I was badgering our battle designers, like, why can't we use, chariots in that way? Because it's not authentic. They're not supposed to be like that. But let's do it like that.
Rule of cool or rule of fun.
It's like when do you have to
deviate from the historical
Yeah.
accuracy to make the game fun, and that's the
I guess
difficulty.
you did ultimately with introducing Mesopotamia, who did have the not chariots,
Some cavalry,
cavalry,
yeah.
didn't they?
We ultimately got the excuse to include some cavalry. The other, previously we also snuck them with the Amazons. Because we chose to interpret them as close to a Scythian faction. Not that Scythians existed at that time, in the same way, but they were like proto-Scythians. And that gave us also the kind of the plausible explanation of why to include a little bit of
scrapping the
cavalry.
barrel for variety in the battle. And Total War.
How can we get horses in? Like
Total War tactical battles always like the big half of the whole thing. The tactical battles and the variety in it just not as existent like in these times, or at least not in the traditional sense. Usually it's about variety of weapons, so the technology needs to be advanced enough so you can differentiate between factions based on technology. Oh, we have better rifles, we don't have rifles at all. In the case of, say, it's Japanese versus the newcomers. But in those times, we often joke it's like stickmen versus mud people. It's like the team did a lot of searching to try and flesh out different play styles.
What is the technology we're going to do when it's like the technology didn't advance for such a long time?
Yeah. And there was like later ages they have at least military organizations that is more advanced. The Romans introduced all this tactical fighting and formations, and the Greeks were more more like a lot of people talking. Every now and then they brawl. Whoever wins, gets to stay here. The other ones go home to their islands. And that's so.
But the cool thing about challenges is that they ultimately drive innovation. Because when you overcome them, we need to find clever ways to do it. And we had to introduce, different layers of different types of infantry. We had to introduce stuff like the dynamic grass, that you could, hide into the dynamic terrains. That initially just the terrains and then make them dynamic, so that they could, figure out into the calculations of battle, like in your strategy, whether you're going to move with your heavy units through the mud and risk them being pinned down and slowed there. So all of this kind of broad variety that didn't exist on the level that we naturally have in other historical eras.
Obviously, there's a lot that goes into game dev, and you've all contributed to the games yourselves. But what are you most proud of, Jack? I'll start with you.
So one of the cool new things we did in Troy is the music systems and the way that it interacts with what the player's doing is always a bit of an iteration. I've worked on every Total War since Attila, so it's always like, okay, what can we do that's like new and try and like add something into it that's different before? How can we try and represent the emotions that the player's feeling, or we want the player to feel, and represent the gameplay and the aesthetics of everything going on, and we try and obviously do that better each time. So one of the things we did in Troy that we hadn't done before was the concept of what we call the ambient music system on campaign. So on previous Total Wars, you generally have a nice track that plays responding to some gameplay, and on Three Kingdoms, I added in this little idea of having just a phrase of the previous track that had played on a different instrument from it. So you had a nice little break in between these quite big tracks. For Troy, we took that further and be like, right, okay, well, how can we respond more specifically to what the player's like looking at directly? So the ambient music system was based to represent the different cultures on the map. Like, so you've got your Trojan factions and the Greek factions, the Achaean ones. And we're like, okay, cool, well, this is going to be interesting, so we'll flavor them differently, so you have slightly different instrumentation. So we try to pick instruments and scales that hopefully would have been sort of representative of the music from those times. And as you scroll over the map, you hear different instrumentation based on what's going on, and also responds to the diplomatic status you have with them. So when you go near your enemies, you start hearing war drums, and there's different layers of drones. So you have like a nice peaceful drone when you're over in your home cities. It's like, oh, this is pleasant. Or your allies. We go over neutral. It's a bit more of a neutral sounding one. And if you go scrolling near your enemy ones, you get some more like pulsing or some really modern style percussion mixed in with some drums and like a more angry sounding drone as well, to try and shape specifically what you're looking at a little bit more on the campaign map. Originally, it was also going to try and respond to the the terrain of what you're looking at as well, but it was like, okay, this scope has just gone crazy. We can't do all of this. We're trying to represent too many things at once. You can't tell. It's like, oh, okay, I'm looking at a mountain now, and I'm hearing this drone. It's like, no, this is too much. Let's simplify. So, yeah, that was one of the cool new things for Troy, and we took that stage further with Pharaoh as well.
Victor, what are you most proud of?
A few things. First, on Troy in general, I'm really proud of my colleague with whom we worked on the multi-resource economy. We often, like in the early pre-production, we went to other teams who were more experienced than us in Horsham and asked them about this, and they were like, "Don't do it," and we were like, "No."
was that from trying before and it being difficult? Yeah.
It was interesting for me to balance. I haven't been involved in the resource economy balancing, and we thought we nailed it at the end. And there was this friend producer who came and said, "This is completely garbage. You're doing a good job, but the economy is very unbalanced. It's easy for me to get resources." And I'm like, because I know at this time I'm thinking, I nailed it. Finally, it clicked after so much time. I have the graphs, I have the simulations, everything's working out, and in my computer it evens out. And I'm like, what difficulty was you playing on the campaign? And he's like, easy. And I'm like,
well, yeah. The game's easy. I'm doing my job.
Yes. So
By design.
Good job there.
I'm proud of many things.
That we shipped.
Definitely,
it's always a good feeling to have shipped.
Yeah.
Definitely that we even managed to develop those games.
Yeah.
It's a miracle.
Honestly.
Games exist.
Games exist. Yeah.
So even there, I could stop him there. As a game director, and later even as the creative director on the studio, so even less involved directly with this, I can never claim ownership on anything. My hands are everywhere, but I can never claim full ownership because we have talented teams doing
Just claim
all the stuff.
Yeah.
All the stuff. So it's small bits and pieces everywhere. I also like how we did multiple small bits, like there was a feature where you could pet Cerberus. This was not mine. But it was another small thing coming from part of the team that wasn't initially planned. I insisted, for example, on the epic skin of Achilles, like the god-forged armor. We researched it thoroughly.
Was it like Hephaestus?
The Hephaestus armor of Achilles. That was something I was very invested into and put probably silly amount of time into searching that. So yeah, here and there, small bits.
And there we have it. Thank you, Jack, Maya, Victor, for joining me today, and thank you for coming along to this Pharaoh and Troy retrospective. Do make sure to like and subscribe. If you don't, you might miss the next one, which is all about Total War Warhammer. We'll see you there.